Hello, I am Tracy Coleman, and we will be discussing today the IDEA MOE local requirement for the 15-16 submission. This is what we will be discussing today, your 2015-16 IDEA MOE submission. First, let's talk about the regulatory requirements as it relates to maintenance of effort. DOE is required by federal regulation to ensure that all school divisions, and this year all state-operated programs, anyone that's receiving a Part B allocation is required to meet a maintenance of effort obligation. The MOE regulatory requirement is that school divisions are to spend at least the same amount of local or local plus state dollars for the current school year on the delivery of special education and related services for students with disabilities as were spent from that same source in the last fiscal year the LEA met the IDEA requirement. I realize that's a lot being said. I will cover what that looks like and what that will mean for your LEA later in this presentation. This is a recent change. In 2015, there was a change to the regulation. On April 28, 2015, the U.S. Department of Education published final regulations that changed how we interpreted or how we applied the LEA MOE requirement. These changes were revised to include a clarification of the compliance standard, along with the explanation of the subsequent years rule. It included specific specifications for the consequences of not meeting the LEA requirement, and we shared that information with school divisions in August of 2015. As a result of these regulations, a web-based application was revised to ensure that we captured your MOE data and that it indeed complied with these new regulatory requirements. And we started using the revised application for the 2014-2015 submission. So this will be the second year the LEAs will be submitting their MOE expenditure information based on the subsequent years rule and the changes that were approved in 2015. This document will go through the 4 tests that the LEA has available for meeting or complying with your MOE requirement, along with some allowable exceptions or other provisions that are available to divisions based on whether they've met or didn't meet your requirement as a result of the subsequent year rule. If you don't have access to SSWS, please be sure to gain access to SSWS. That's our portal for capturing data that LEAs are to submit to the DOE. And once you have access to SSWS, make sure that you ask your local SSWS administrator to give you access rights and read rights to the IDEA MOE application. Please refer to Superintendent's Memo number 304-16 for guidance and for information on how to actually submit your data using the application. One document is a guidance document that will cover the MOE requirement along with the allowable exceptions, and it also includes a user's guide on how to use the application for submitting your information. The presentation today will cover both topics. The collection window for submission opened on December 19, 2016 and will close on February 28th. The IDEA MOE application must be used to submit all costs associated with providing special education and related services to children or students with disabilities that are above and beyond the cost of providing regular education. Remember, students with disabilities are to receive equal access to all services. They are eligible to receive access to the same building, the same pencils, the same desk that general education students have access to. Students with disabilities are required to have access to the general education curriculum when possible. They're to receive equal access to any services, the individualized education plan, is available to ensure that those added costs are captured as part of your maintenance of effort requirement. Any costs associated with capital outlay or the regular education component are to be excluded from maintenance of effort or for calculating your expenditure amounts for maintenance of effort. Costs that are incurred as a result of the Comprehensive Services Act, or CSA, should not be included. As a result, these students would not be included in your per capita calculation. First, let's talk about the MOE expenditures and how you may calculate your MOE amount. At this point in time, most school divisions have already submitted the annual school report. That is a good place to start if you've already captured that data. Expenditures for special ed and related services must be reported by source of funds, state and local only. Federal funds or federal expenditures are not to be included or not to be used to determine whether the division has met its MOE requirement. Again, you are only to submit state and local expenditure amounts only. Each entry must represent actual expenses and be consistent with federal and state definitions of special ed and related service. The primary requisite for reporting expenses for the purpose of MOE is that the division will only report those expenses the division incurred for students with disabilities for whom the division is legally responsible for serving. For example, you may be serving some students that reside in a different jurisdiction. You're not legally responsible for serving those students. You may have agreements with other school divisions where you have a centralized program in your division, and that other school division may send their students to your program, and you receive tuition for those students. You are not legally responsible for serving those students, so as a result, you are not to include the expenses associated with students that you are serving, but not legally responsible for serving. Those expenses will be covered by the legally responsible school division and not by the division that is actually serving the students. The IDEA MOE application will include the final state fiscal year 2015 division expenditures. Remember, that's information you would have your last year's submission. However, due to the subsequent years rule, the amount for your 2015 expenses may not be the amount that's used to determine whether you've met your local plus state or local expenditure amounts for the provision of special ed and related services. Again, as a result of the subsequent years rule. Expenditures entered in the MOE application may differ from the expenses in your ASR. Remember, we just discussed you may be serving students that you are not legally responsible for serving. When you capture information in your annual school report, typically you capture all expense information based on all students you serve, including those that you are not legally responsible for serving. So as a result, there may be some differences between the expenses that you included for special ed in the ASR than the expenses that you will include for MOE. There are many instances where they may differ, but depending on your school division, that may not differ. The amounts that you include for special ed in your ASR may exactly match the amounts that you include for MOE. It will vary based on the circumstances for your division and the students that actually take advantage of the services or the educational programs in your jurisdiction. Expenditures reported in the ASR includes all funding sources. Remember, we are only capturing state and local expenditures for MOE. We do not capture federal expenses. So you will need to remove any expenses that are covered through federal funds, since we will only be capturing state and local expenses. Expenses are to include direct instruction for the provision of students with disabilities. These are services that are included as a result of the student's IEP. I'm not talking about the services that the students may receive as a result of the general curriculum for the general education component of their program. Remember, students with disabilities are to receive equal access to the curriculum, equal access to the teachers, equal access to the program that they are eligible and deemed appropriate to receive based on the general education program. Any costs associated with implementing the IEP are considered above and beyond the cost of educating general ed students. Any costs such as salaries and benefits, whether it's a full-time position or some type of prorated cost based on the special ed component of the service, those costs can be included in the expenses for MOE. Any costs associated with special transportation that is called for in an IEP can be included in the expense amount. Prorated, or the proportionate amount of any equipment or certain construction costs as it relates to students with disabilities, can be included. Costs associated with related services or the regional or local jail in your jurisdiction for students with disabilities can be included, along with costs for providing special ed for any homebound or home-based model instructions. Tuition paid to another school division. We're back into whether you are actually sending your students to another school division to be served, and you are paying that division for those services, then you can include the amount of the tuition that you paid. But if you are receiving tuition from another school division and it's for students that you're not legally responsible for serving, you are to exclude any amounts of tuition received for those students. Expenditures excluded, of course, is the tuition that you receive from another LEA for a program of service. It excludes any general capital outlay expenses, any general transportation costs. For example, you may have a school bus where you have transportation services for all students, and so happen the students on the bus may have an IEP. They may be a special needs student. If the transportation cost is for general ed and it's not a special route that's being run specifically for special ed, those transportation costs are not to be included if it's for general transportation services for all students, including students with disabilities. The only costs to be included would be those that are called for in an IEP. Any costs associated with the CSA or local match component is to be excluded, and any expenditures that apply to all students, meaning students that do not have an IEP, are to be excluded from your MOE calculation. This is a worksheet that we've made available to school divisions as they ask. You're not required to do this crosswalk, but it is a helpful tool for school divisions to be able to document their MOE calculation for your school division. Remember, I talked about your annual school report submission, and you include expenses for all students, including students with disabilities. There are certain components of the ASR where it's relatively easy to determine your special ed account because your accounting system have coded those students. So for example, in the 61100 section of your ASR, where you've captured expenses for classroom instruction for special ed teachers at the elementary school level, in that section of your ASR, it may exactly agree with your MOE expenses in that section. But you'll notice the highlighted areas may be areas of the ASR where you will have to prorate or extract certain dollar amounts. For example, under the 61200 section of your ASR, you have captured expenses for social workers and guidance counselors. The amount captured in the ASR is for all social workers and any guidance counselors you have, or school counselors, I believe is the appropriate term now, that you may have in your division. However, if those school social workers and those school counselors are not providing services to students with disabilities, they are not to be included in your capturing of expenses for MOE. But for the services that are called for in an IEP, then the school division is responsible for capturing that information. Please remember, capturing based on how many special ed students are in a building is not a good costing mechanism to use. For example, we've seen instances for school nurses. You may have a nurse assigned to your building. Those nurses provide services to all students, including students with disabilities. Just because a student has an IEP doesn't necessarily mean that student goes and see a nurse more frequently than a student without disabilities. So a student may go see the nurse as called for in an IEP or based on a special need, but prorating costs for that nurse because 10% of your population happens to be students with disabilities is not an appropriate allocation of costs. What would be more ideal is an allocation based on the needs of the students and based on the IEP of the student. So keep that in mind when you prorate for services in a building that may be related to either the principals in the building or the assistant principals or any other staff that may be providing services to students with disabilities. It's your responsibility to ensure that you prorate those expenses and that you have documentation and evidence in your school division for capturing that data. Another example would be for transportation costs. The student on the school bus may have an IEP, but that's somewhat irrelevant because you're providing transportation for all students. The student with the IEP is to receive equal access to that transportation. So simply because the student has an IEP, it doesn't cause for specialized transportation services. So as a result, you are not to capture that expense as part of MOE. However, if there's a special run that you have to pay for, there are special services for that student, then of course, please do include that expense as a part of your MOE information. The ASR includes federal funding. You are to exclude the federal funding from MOE. We are only capturing state and local. I want to highlight for you once again, prorated costs should not include a blanket application of costs simply based on the number of students in a building or the number of students on a school bus. Expenditures included should be associated with the provision of special ed and related service for the division. Typically, that's as called for in an IEP. Any methodology or costing mechanism that's used for the school division should not vary from year to year, meaning you will use the same methodology from one year to the next. For example, you should not make an arbitrary decision. This year, I'm going to compute special ed costs as it relates to transportation. But next year, I'm going to exclude transportation costs altogether. That's not consistent. That's not necessarily accurate. You're changing your methodology from year to year so that you will not capture that information. Some divisions do it for varying reasons. Some do it so that they will not over-report, or probably over-reporting is not the appropriate word, but you don't want to capture too much of a special ed cost because you know that the next year you may have some reductions in your budget. So you want to arbitrarily or methodically decide to exclude certain expenses. My advice is to be consistent from year to year and to utilize accurate reporting for your MOE data. Let's talk about the MOE test itself. Once you've identified your expenses for special ed and related services, and you are to enter that information in the application, you've captured your local expenses and your local plus state expenses combined. Typically, you'll have an amount for local and you'll have an amount for state, and you combine those two numbers in order to determine your state and local amount for MOE. You'll also need to calculate, or the application itself will calculate, your local per capita for your expenses along with your local and state per capita expenses. Again, these expenses are for the provision of students with disabilities in your school division, and the test or the rule or regulation that we'll be using will be based on whether you meet the subsequent year's rule. This provides you with a very good picturesque way of looking at the subsequent year's rule. Typically, you've already submitted your MOE expenses for your 13-14 school year, 14-15, 15-16, and now you will be doing your 15-16 submission. And we'll talk about your MOE compliance requirement along with your MOE eligibility requirement. Remember, the MOE eligibility requirement is necessary for you to submit as part of your annual plan application. So the subsequent year rule doesn't just impact your compliance, it also impacts your ability to meet your MOE requirements in the following years. For your MOE submission, let's say you met your MOE requirement using local funds according to this slide in 2014-15. We've identified the different methodologies or different tests that your division may have met in various years. So in this particular example, the school division met their MOE requirement using tests 1, 2, 3, and 4, and all 4 tests in your 13-14 submission. In your 14-15 submission, the LEA met your MOE requirement based on test number 1 and test number 3. Test number 1 uses your local funds only, and test number 3 uses your local funds per capita. So now you're at your submission for 15-16. Your expenses for local was only $400, which means you didn't meet your MOE requirement using that test in 15-16 because you are required to spend $550. For test 2, you met your MOE requirement using this test based on expenses submitted. For 13-14, $1,000. You are required to spend the same or more each year based on which test or which methodology you're planning to meet your MOE requirement. For test 2, the MOE was met, meeting test 2. Your required amount was $1,000. You spent $1,100, so you met your MOE requirement using test 2. Test 3, you didn't meet your MOE requirement in 15-16. For test 4, you met your MOE requirement because you were required to spend $100, you spent $110. This is for 15-16. Going forward, for the 16-17 school year that is yet to end, when you submit your eligibility or your budget information in your annual plan, your required level of effort for test 1 will be $550 because that is based on the last time you met your MOE requirement using that test. Your dollar amount for meeting test 2 will be $1,100 because that's the last time you met using that method. And for test 3 and test 4, test 3 will be $55 and test 4 will be $110. The $55 comes from the 14-15 submission, since that was the last time you met test 3, and the $110 comes from your 15-16 submission because that's the last time you met using that method. A question we often receive is whether there are any waivers to MOE. Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. There are no waivers of MOE available to an LEA. However, there are some provisions that are built into the regulation. There are 4 allowable exceptions along with 1 provision to allow school divisions to meet your MOE requirement. We'll cover those in more detail in this presentation. These are captured here just as a high-level way of showing you what those provisions happens to be. They reference the section in the regulation that provides the regulatory language for the implementation of this provision. For example, under section 300.204A, it involves explanations for your voluntary departure. Under 300.204B, decrease in enrollment. 300.204C, termination of an obligation of an LEA to provide a program. Again, we'll walk through each of these in the application section. I will incorporate the requirements as it relates to your MOE submission, along with covering how you will submit that information to DOE. The IDEA MOE application was created to allow school divisions to capture and for the state to capture LEA's expenditure information in a centralized system. It retains historical information so that you can always go back and make a determination about when the last time you met your MOE requirement as a result of the subsequent years rule. So it's a nice handy way for school divisions to make a determination of whether you met and to ensure that you are mindful of what your obligations are in future years. You can access the application by going to the VDOE homepage. Once you get to the DOE homepage, you'll notice over on the right-hand side there is a link to the SSWS login. You will need to ensure that you have access to SSWS in order to gain access to the IDEA MOE application. Once you have access to SSWS, your local SSWS administrator should be able to provide you with your login ID along with your password. We have dual certification in SSWS. This slide demonstrates your screen that will appear in order for you to enter your login ID. The next slide will demonstrate the screen that will appear for you to enter your password. This screen demonstrates what may or may not appear for you. This is a demonstration screen. What's important for you here is to be able to look for the application that you will use to submit your MOE information. If you do not see the Individuals with Disabilities Act Maintenance of Effort application, you will need to contact your local SSWS administrator and ask them to give you read and write access to this particular application. Hopefully it's in your menu of options when you log into SSWS, but if not, you'll need to contact your local SSWS administrator. This isn't something that I will be able to give you access to. Only your local SSWS administrator can give you access to this particular application. Once you've gained access to the application and you've selected to enter the particular application, you should notice that the collection window for the school year of 2014-15 or 15-16 is being collected this year. The screen will be very similar to what you may see here. Please select over on the right side the various options that are available to you. You can jump right away into entering your expenditures. Remember, we've already covered what your process should be for calculating your local expenses along with calculating your state expenses. This provides a very brief overview of the screens that you will have available. The instructions link will take you to the guidance document in case you would like to print it out or review it as you're doing your submission. Once you enter your information, it has access where you will enter your expenses for the 15-16 school year. It may show you or will show you the dollar amounts from your 14-15 submission, but do remember that the amounts that are appearing for 14-15 may not be the actual amounts that is being compared to determine whether you've met your MOE requirement as a result of the subsequent years rule that we just discussed. The reports menu is available to you throughout the year, even when the collection window is closed. This allows you to go back and be able to print your maintain exceptions report and your verification report from previous years. From time to time, there's new staff, there are changeover in responsibilities. This way, you can always have access to your information and your data and be able to review that information should someone ask. This figure demonstrates the screen that will appear when you select the Enter Expenditures option. Again, it displays your 14-15 expenditure amount, although your 14-15 expenditure amount may not be the amount that your 15-16 amounts are compared to. This screen demonstrates the same Enter Expenditures screen that will appear, except that we are entering data so that you can see how it will appear once you enter your information. The comparison year may or may not be expenses from 14-15. It may be a different year. The 14-15 information is read-only and is only there for you for informational purposes. If you need more information about the MOE requirements and how you determine your expenses, you can always refer to the guidance document. That's a handy tool to keep near you when you get ready to enter your information. We do realize it's sometimes hard to remember all of the MOE and requirements, the subsequent years rule, along with the allowable exceptions and provisions that are available. So it's always a good idea to keep these guidance documents handy and available to you to reference as you go through your submission. Once you've entered your 15-16 expenditure information, the application will automatically compare it to the last time you met your MOE requirement based on each of the 4 tests. In this particular example, the LEA met its MOE requirement using all 4 tests. If you met your MOE requirement using all 4 tests, you're pretty much done. You can submit your information. If you've met your MOE requirement or you did not, we will walk through some of the screens and information that may appear based on your particular circumstance or based on your particular situation. In this example, the LEA met its MOE requirement using all 4 tests. Since you've submitted or decided to submit your data to MOE. Once you select your Submit to DOE button, this particular screen will appear. This is your option on whether you selected that button by mistake. If it was by mistake and you're not ready to submit, by all means, please cancel. Your information will not be submitted. However, if you're ready, you can select OK. Once you select OK, the information will become read-only. You will not be able to make any changes. If you end up hitting that button in error and the collection window is still open, you can contact me at the email available and I'll be able to reopen the collection window for you. Again, if you're ready to submit, hit OK. If not, select cancel. Once you've hit OK and submitted your data, the application will be locked and it will reflect that you have met or you have submitted your data to DOE and you can no longer access the application. You'll still be able to go to the various screens. You can enter data for future years, just not for the year for 15-16 since you've already submitted that information. But you can use the application as a calculator because remember, you'll need to submit your eligibility or your budget amounts and meet your eligibility requirements as part of your annual plan submission. So this application can be used as a calculator to determine whether you are in fact in compliance with the eligibility requirement going forward. Your provisions or your maintain exceptions button is available if you need to submit data, but if you've met all 4 tests, then obviously you won't need to submit any allowable exceptions. The maintain exceptions or the reports are available for school divisions to use. However, you cannot run the report for 15-16 until after it has been reviewed and approved by the DOE. So if you attempt to run your verification report for your 15-16 submission in advance of your receiving approval from DOE, it will not appear for you. This particular screen shows this when you select the Maintain Exceptions screen. Again, this is read-only. It provides you with the school year information that you can select from. So for your 15-16 school year, this particular screen shows that you've met all 4 tests. You can always log back into SSWS and the MOE application in order to determine your status. Again, you cannot run your verification report until after your expenditure information has been reviewed and approved by DOE. If we review your information and there are questions that we still need to have answered, you will need to make some revisions. What will happen is we will deny your submission. Typically, we're in communication with you, so you already know to expect it. The system will automatically send you an email asking you to make revisions. Let's say we've reviewed everything has been approved. You will receive an email that will let you know that you are now ready to submit your verification report. Again, your division cannot submit the verification report until after a notice of approval has been received. Typically, that's through an email that the submitter will receive once your submission has been approved. At that time, you can then go back and review and run your verification report. If your division has met your MOE requirement, you are to submit your verification report that has been signed by your superintendent or the designee. If the division has not met its MOE requirement after the revision and resubmitting, the division will need to follow other steps. That will be covered starting in slide number 33 as we go forward. But we will cover each of those scenarios going forward. Depending on what situation is applicable to you, you can always fast forward to that situation that is applicable. The first scenario we've discussed is when a division has met the MOE requirement. If you've met your MOE requirement, the screen that will display when you select the reports option will allow you to run your verification report, and you can also run your maintain exceptions report. The maintain exceptions report do not need to be submitted to DOE. However, the verification report does, and it needs to include the signature of your superintendent or the superintendent's designee. This is the screen that will appear when the user has selected your view report and you've selected to view your verification report. You've met your MOE requirement. You received an email saying that it has been reviewed and approved by the DOE. You're now logging back in to run your verification report. Once you select verification report, it will ask you for which year you're running the report for. You will generate the report for the 15-16 submission by selecting that year and selecting View Report. This is an example of a verification report. The report will vary based on your situation. Again, you will need to include the signature of your superintendent or the superintendent's designee. The report tells you whether you've met your MOE requirement, and it also reflects whether the amount that you will need to budget for in the coming year, meaning it will tell you the required level of effort for the following school year or the following fiscal year. Next, we'll talk about those divisions that have not met all 4 tests. Instead, you've maybe met 1 test, or you've met 2 or 3 tests, but it's something that's less than the 4 tests. If you've met less than 4 tests, then the situation and decisions will vary for each school division. These are some of the things you need to consider. If you've met all 4 tests, easy peasy, job is done. You've submitted your data. No additional information will be required other than us verifying the accuracy of your data. But if you've met more than or less than the 4 tests, you can possibly proceed by providing information as it relates to the allowable exceptions that are available to you. But that's a decision that the LEA will need to make. If you have not met any of the 4 tests, then obviously you are to proceed and move forward with providing additional information. This particular screen demonstrates an LEA who has not met any of the 4 tests. If you haven't met any of the 4 tests and you feel confident that you've captured the expenditure data accurately for your school division, then you're to select Save and Next. When you select Save and Next, it will take you to a new screen. In this particular screen, I'm going to walk through the various scenarios before I get to the screen that will demonstrate some of the allowable exceptions. In the previous screen, it provided you with an LEA that met none of the 4 tests. In this example, the LEA met 1 of the 4 tests. Again, you can choose to submit by meeting all of the only 1 of the tests. You're not required to meet all 4 tests in any submission. The comparison year going forward will be based on the last time you met using whichever method. So for the next year, the amounts will be established for test number 1 using your submission for the 15-16 school year. So the comparison year will be the year that's based on the last time you met using that method. So in this example again, this is based on an LEA that met the MOE requirement using 1 test. This screen will demonstrate the LEA that met that test, but also has a reduction in child count, meaning you have fewer students in 1 year in comparison to the previous year. In this situation, the allowable exception under 300.204B is available. If it's available to your LEA, the application will automatically apply it for you. If it's not available, the application will not apply it. Let's talk about what the allowable exception under 300.204 means. A school division may reduce the level of expenditures below the previous year's expenses if the reduction is attributable to a decrease in enrollment of students with disabilities. This will be done by comparing your December 1 child count for the current year of the submission against the prior year submission. And it will automatically calculate the reduction that is applicable to your school division based on that loss of students. The methodology or the reasoning behind this is that if you have fewer students in special ed, then obviously the costs associated with providing services will typically go down. So this is an allowable exception of when your expenses may go down from one particular year because of a loss of students. The application will automatically calculate that dollar amount, and we will compare that. Remember, you submit your December 1 child count information to the Department of Ed, and as a result, we have captured your information based on your submission, and we've done that calculation for you using data that you've already submitted to the Department of Ed. Depending on your situation, the 300.204B screen will appear differently for your school division. Some school divisions will continue to have a growth in the identification of students with disabilities, while other school divisions may have a reduction in enrollment, whether that's for general ed or for special ed. But in this situation, we're comparing your students with disabilities child count information from one year compared to the previous year, and if you have fewer students in the current year than you had in the previous year, then there will be a calculation that's automatically done in the application. However, if it's not, then it will not appear to you for you. The options that are available, for example, if you did not meet any of the 4 tests, then you will have different options available depending on your situation. But in this situation, we're talking about the 4 options available because you didn't meet any of the 4 tests. Because the LEA or the school division didn't meet any of the 4 tests, there are 4 options available. Option 1 captures the expenses or the amount of the shortfall based on local expenses only. Option 2 captures local plus state expenses and captures the amount of the shortfall based on state and local expenses. Option 3 is the dollar amount based on your 300.204B reduction in child count. That's your per capita using local only. There's also an adjustment being made if you have a reduction in state and local expenses, then your per capita amount will be adjusted based on your 300.204B reduction. This particular screen appears when there isn't a reduction in child count. So as a result, you will not see a calculation for the 300.204B allowable exception. You didn't realize a decrease in enrollment, so as a result, this allowable exception isn't applicable to you. So the screen that will appear will differ from the screen that you saw previously. You will still have 4 options available because you didn't meet any of the 4 tests, and you will select those dollar amounts. The only difference is if there is a 300.204B adjustment to your expenses, it will be automatically applied in the application. In this particular screen, it's not applicable. As such, it is not applied. You are, however, required to select a dollar amount to go forward. We do not dictate or tell you which dollar amount to select. That's strictly up to the school division. You select the amount that you believe is appropriate, or you believe that you have reductions in order to capture the expenses that you've lost based on the allowable exceptions available. I will cover each of those allowable exceptions as we go through this particular application, but again, that's a local decision. That's an option that's available to you. Once you make the selection in the application, if you haven't submitted your data, you can always go back and choose a different dollar amount. So don't feel that you are required or stuck on whatever option you make at this point in your submission, because you can always go back and select a different option before you submit it to DOE. The only difference is if you do choose to change the options or choose a different selection later on in your submission, just make sure you go through each of the screens in the application, because sometimes if you do not follow through each of the screens in consecutive order, there is a calculation order that may happen in the application where the numbers are not computed correctly behind the scenes. But feel free to go through and adjust information as you need to, adjust your expenditures as you need to, but please do so before you submit your data to DOE. In this particular screen, the LEA have met 2 of the 4 tests. So as a result, there are 3 options available to the LEA. The LEA can choose not to submit any data. They don't have any allowable exceptions. They don't have any retirements. They don't have any reduction in child count information. They don't have any graduations of students that were exceptionally costly, or any of the other allowable exceptions that are available to the school division. In this scenario, the LEA is choosing, if you choose not to submit allowable exception data, then you select no allowable exceptions and the application will conclude. But if you do have some expenses and you want to go through that information, then you select one of the other 2 options available. Remember, there are 3. One is if you're not planning to submit any allowable exception data. The second option, you fail test 2 in this particular scenario. And test 2 in this scenario says that you didn't spend the same or more in local and state expenditures. And option 3 is you fail test 4, where you didn't meet your local and state per capita amount. I only say this multiple times because I get questioned multiple times. The LEA only has to pass 1 of the 4 tests that are available. The ability for you to submit allowable expenditure information or allowable exceptions information going forward is to allow you flexibility in the coming year, because you can only submit retirements in the year in which they occur. You will not be able to capture that information in future years. For example, if you had a teacher that retired at the end of the 15-16 school year, you chose not to submit that allowable exception information as a result of that retirement, we don't have a way of going back and capturing that information in the 16-17 submission because you didn't submit it in 15-16. This is available to school divisions. It's simply your choice. We didn't want to pigeonhole the school divisions or to limit your ability to submit that information to us should you so choose. The LEA can change options prior to your submission. You can always save and come back later if you're not quite sure. But once your data have been submitted, then you no longer have the permissions or you're no longer allowed to make any revisions. But as long as the collection window is open, and as long as you haven't submitted your data, then you can go back and toggle through the different menu options. And if the collection window is still open and you submitted it prior than you actually plan to submit, we can always reopen the collection window prior to the close date. We're going to walk through the allowable exceptions. We talked a little bit about the allowable exception under 300.204B. That one is automatically calculated by the application. You don't necessarily need to do anything other than being aware that it's being applied for you. However, each of these allowable exceptions going forward, we will capture and talk about the information that you will be required to submit and retain in your school division. When you select allowable exception 300.204A, let's say you've selected Save and Next. The next screen that will appear is this particular allowable exception. Under 300.204A, an LEA may reduce the level of expenses below the previous year's spending if the reduction is attributable to the voluntary departure by retirement or otherwise, or departure for just cause. For example, a teacher retired, or there was a resignation, or someone moved. It may include any savings that were realized as a result of a personnel change, where you hired someone at a lower salary than the person in the position previously may have been paid. Also, it must be a result of the staff member's decision to leave. It cannot be the result of a school division's decision to invite someone to leave. However, it must be voluntary in nature, a retirement, resignation, or move. If you need additional information, that's available to you in the guidance documents that's attached to the superintendent's memos. There's a link that's here that's also related to a Dear Colleague letter concerning contractors. In the past, we may have communicated that the cost for contractors could not be considered as part of this allowable exception. However, we have received additional guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. I would advise that you read this particular letter. The link is here for you to be able to access. It's also available on the DOE's website under the special education page under grants and funding. And it captures under which circumstances a contractor's cost may be used to reduce your expenses. Even when it's applied to contractors, it should be based on a voluntary nature. It won't be voluntary if it's considered doing more for less, meaning that you were able to procure services for an occupational therapist at a lower rate than you were previously. That's not necessarily a voluntary departure. There have to be certain measures and certain reasons for the contractor leaving or the expense going down as a result of the contractor. I'm not going to cover those scenarios in this presentation. However, I do advise that you read this on your own and use it accordingly based on your situation in your school division. I'm only reiterating because this is a question that comes up frequently. MOE allowable exception under Section 300.204A does not include reduction in force or other termination. Remember, it's voluntary in nature. It's not an invitation by the LEA for you to leave or an invitation for the teacher to leave. It does not include an LEA transfer of a staff member to another position if that transfer was not voluntary in nature. If a teacher volunteered to transfer to a different building or a different position, that's considered voluntary. However, if the LEA chose to transfer the staff member, that is not considered voluntary. And it also does not include medical leave. If the person is out on medical leave, not receiving pay, that's not considered a voluntary departure. This particular screen will appear when the LEA chooses the 300.204A selection. If you do have voluntary departures, you will need to capture that information for each of the positions that you plan to submit to DOE for consideration. This is the summary screen for 300.204A submission. When you're ready, please select the Add New Personnel button, and it will take you to the detail screen where information will be captured. This slide demonstrates the detailed information screen for the 300.204A submission. Please see slides at 49 and 50 to review each of the lines that are available. I'm going to walk through them very quickly. You can read them on your own as it is very detail oriented. I'm only going to highlight those areas that we find or we receive questions about routinely. This is for demonstration, but I do want to iterate that this information is available for you to read and to go through specifically, and I wanted to demonstrate what the screen would look like if you so choose to select the 300.204A option for voluntary departures. The 300.204B option, remember, is for a reduction in child count that's automatically computed by the system. This particular information for the 300.204A is for you, and you will need to provide the DOE with information for those voluntary departures. Once you've entered that data, you can choose to save. If you've made a mistake, obviously you can delete that information and start over again. Again, this is here for you to read specifically. There are some screens or some information that has been marked with an asterisk, which means you are required to enter that data. The required fields will prevent you from being able to save your information. So if you see an asterisk that's required, we also want to make sure that we are meeting the federal requirement and that this particular allowable exception is applicable to you. So we try to capture sufficient information in order to make a decision. Again, we're only looking at state and local expenditures. So if the position was paid for out of federal funds, then that position is not applicable to use under this allowable exception or any exception, because we're only looking at expenses that were paid out of state and local funds, not out of federal funds. It would be helpful if you would provide to the DOE the employee ID number along with of the previous employee, along with the employee ID number of the new employee. This is useful for audit purposes. It's useful for information or for consistency or being able to go back and remember what has been done previously and rhyming reasons why. There are times when there are turnover in a school division, and it's always helpful if the LEA has a notebook or a file where the person coming after them can go back and follow what was done previously. So as always, retain all supporting documentation in your files locally. It should be available for audit purposes should we ask or anyone ask for verification and to be able to track the rhyme and reason behind your submission. We also realize that when you fill a position, sometimes it's vacated before the end of the school year. Let's say, for example, a new teacher is hired, starts the year in September. New teacher decides not to continue in that position, whether they voluntarily leave the division or voluntarily transfer to a new position. As a result, you now have a substitute in this very same position. The substitute comes in at a different dollar amount. So you can always add different dollar amounts for the same position. For example, new teacher, $1 amount. Let's say they work from September to October. Substitute teacher worked from October to December. You found a new hire that came in January. So now you have 3 people in one position. That way you're capturing the information and the historical fact behind that particular situation, and we and you will be able to follow what may have happened or transpired as it relates to this or that particular position. So we've tried to include various scenarios or real life scenarios that take effect in a school division so that we can capture as much data as possible. The next screen that will appear once you've entered all of your personnel information under 300.204A, will give you the option of providing or showing you what your remaining shortfall may be. Let's assume you do have one. So once you've entered data under 300.204A and you've selected Save Next, the next screen will appear. We're back to the summary screen, and you'll notice that it has now captured a position that has been entered for a teacher that has retired. It includes the salary that was from the previous year. You paid $75,000 for a SPED teacher, and it would include your salary and benefit costs for a teacher. So $75,000 that was included previously, or that was paid for this particular position in the previous year. The new salary for the new year, because you hired someone at a significantly lower dollar amount, you're now paying $45,000 for the person that has taken over this position, and you have a salary savings of about $30,000. You'll notice over on the right hand side, it still indicates that there's a shortage of a little bit over $46,000. The system will continue to compute that amount as you enter more and more data. If you have new positions or new personnel to add, always select to add new personnel. If not, you will select next and it'll take you to the next available screen. In this scenario, we're moving forward to MOE Allowable Exception under 300.204C. Under 300.204C, the division can reduce the level of expense below the previous years if the reduction is attributable to the termination of the obligation of the agency to provide a program of special ed to a particular child with a disability that is an exceptionally costly program. Plain English, that means, let's say you have a student that was requiring private placement, for example. Private placement typically costs significantly more than what it would cost for you to educate that student in your jurisdiction. If the student was costing you, for example, $100,000 a year for that placement, the IEP has been changed. The least restrictive environment will be bringing that child back in your school division, for example. The cost of the program or service for that particular kid is no longer $100,000 as was paid in the previous year. You're now only paying $50,000 for the cost of service for that particular kid. So as a result, you have a savings of $50,000 because you no longer have to provide that program of service for a particular student. The previous program of service was particularly costly. The current program of service is less costly, so obviously that's an allowable exception that you can use to reduce your expenditures in the coming year. However, there are some things for you to consider. First, you need to demonstrate or at least advise whether the student has left the jurisdiction of the agency or the reason for no longer having that costly program. Some of the reasons may be the student reached maximum age, no longer eligible for special education services through the school division, so they're no longer in your jurisdiction. This person may have moved, meaning moved to a different jurisdiction. They left. They no longer need the program. The example I provided was private placement versus internal placement. They no longer need that particular program. If it's a high cost program like a private school, any possible exception generated by this section will be considered on a case-by-case basis, and we will, meaning the DOE, will go through the scenario with you once you've entered that data using this particular allowable exception. It's very unique and very specific. Typically to a student, you'll have to provide that student ID number, and we will do some verification on our end to compare the exceptionally costly program and the amounts that you've provided to us. What it doesn't mean is that you're doing the same thing for less. It does not include being frugal. And the DOE has specific federal guidance as it relates to this particular exception, as it applies to a specific student. It does not apply to a program or to a vendor. This is a slide that will appear if you so choose to use allowable exception 300.204C. If you notice on the right-hand side of the menu, there are the different allowable exceptions that are available. If you go through each of the screens by doing by selecting next, then it will take you through each of the screens in order as they appear. You can toggle through, however, sometimes there are some calculating errors if you skip a screen, but whatever the case, always go through before final submission by selecting next in each of the screens, and that way you will ensure that everything is calculating correctly behind the scenes. In this screen again, 300.204C, you're entering data for a specific student. Let's say you have that situation, you select Add New Student. Once you select Add New Student, you will go from the summary screen to the detail screen. In the detail screen, you will select, in this particular example, the student has reached majority age or maximum age, which means the student is no longer eligible for services in your school division. The student ID or the testing ID number for the student needs to be entered so that we can verify that in fact that student was enrolled and included on your child count submission. Also, we want you to include the cost of the program that you are no longer providing. And if you can, provide some type of explanation that will allow us to make an assessment and to have further communications with you as we walk through this particular scenario. Remember, what the information we're providing is for demonstration purposes only. This is just to capture various scenarios that may apply to you in your school division. This screen is available for you to read so that you will have an explanation of what each of the fields that will be captured under the 300.204C detail screen. Once you've entered data for a particular student in this screen and you select Save, once you click that button, it will take you to the summary screen. The summary screen will now appear differently. It will show you the information for the student that you just entered data for. You'll also notice that your remaining shortage amount has decreased as a result of information that you've entered either under the 300.204 screen for voluntary departures or the automatically computed 300.204B screen if there is a reduction in child count. In this particular scenario, we're done with this particular data submission. So we're going to, instead of selecting Add New Student, we're going to select Next. Next screen that will appear will be your 300.205 option. And this is automatically calculated for you as well. However, it does come with some ties. It's not quite as easy or as simple as it may seem. Most of you are not familiar with this particular option because it wasn't available to you until very recently. Under the 300.205 option, it basically means that in a fiscal year in which the federal allocation received by a school division exceeds the amount received in the previous fiscal year, the division may reduce their level of expense by not more than 50% of the amount of the excess. What that means number-wise, school division received $100,000 from the U.S. Department of Education for special ed in 14-15. The school division received $110,000 in 15-16. That's an increase of $10,000. The school division can then reduce your expenses by $5,000, which is 50% of the increase. $100,000, $110,000, increase of 10, 50% of that is $5,000. However, if you are required to set aside for CEIS, this provision is not applicable to you. If the division did not meet or did not receive the meets requirements designation on its annual determination, this provision is not applicable to you. If the LEA voluntarily set aside funds for CEIS, this provision has some limited allowances. And the division must spend any amount that it selects under this provision for activities that could be supported through ESEA. So, even though this provision is available, it's not available to anyone or to everyone. If this provision is available to you, it comes with certain certification and parameters of when it can be used. You do not have to use this provision. If you choose not to use it, just contact the DOE and we can make the adjustments behind the scene. Again, this is automatically computed because we already know what your allocations are. We know if there's an increase in that allocation, so we can automatically apply that within the application. However, it's your decision on whether you want to take advantage of this particular provision. Also know that if you so choose to take advantage of this particular provision, that this information will be reported to the U.S. Department of Education as part of our Table 8 submission, and this information then goes forward for inclusion in its report to the U.S. Congress. I want to reiterate, this particular provision is available to some school divisions, but not all school divisions, depending on your scenario. This section of the application does not require you to enter any information because we already know the answers to many of the questions. The screen will show if it is applicable, and if an amount is not displayed, then the provision cannot be used by the LEA. This demonstrates the screen that will appear under 300.205. Again, it doesn't require any entries. Only computes if there is an increase in your federal allocation. And if you so choose not to use it, please contact DOE if the auto calculation causes a positive amount in your submission, because again, it's calculating behind the scenes. You won't be able to submit your MOE data if it's causing your expenditure amount to be in a positive situation. Allowable Exception 300.204D. A school division may reduce your level of expense if it's attributable to a termination of a costly expense for long-term purchases. Long-term typically means it is longer than a 1-year useful life. For example, you purchased equipment, or there was a certain construction costs that were related specifically to students with disabilities or a student, or if there are certain supplies or materials that were purchased in 1 year that's going to be used in 2, 3, or 4 or 5 years, then you can then consider that under section 300.204D. Or if you had to pay for a certain program, let's say a reading program for a student, and that reading program is going to be used several years for a particular student as called for in an IEP, the reading program costs you $50,000. Since you're going to be using it subsequent years, then that $50,000 can be used as an allowable exception under 300.204D. Let's talk about what it doesn't mean. It must be, again, based on a long-term purchase. It does not include doing the same thing for less, and it does not include being frugal. This allowable exception is very specific to a particular purchase or expense that the LEA may have incurred. This is the screen that appears for 300.204D. This is the summary screen. Once you select Add New Program, it will take you to your details screen where we will capture information for the 300.204D, which brings up the summary screen for 300.204D. In the summary screen, you are to select whether it was for a purchase of equipment. In this scenario, we purchased an equipment, we purchased a wheelchair for a very costly student. The wheelchair cost for that kid in order to mobilize in the building cost us a little less than $1,500. A very expensive wheelchair. We bought several wheelchairs for $75,000 for students in a building that's, say, isn't equipped to handle students in wheelchairs. Just an example. Doesn't mean this is the situation for your school division. It could be a lift for lifting multi-disabled students who cannot or are not very mobile, and you have to mobilize those kids in a particular classroom. Whatever the situation may be, this is just one example of many that may occur or may have happened in your school division. We made reference to a particular purchase order number so that we can trace it back to a particular order for multiple wheelchairs that were purchased in the previous year for $75,000, and the cost in the next year is only $58,000. Obviously, there's a savings. You can, if you have multiple purchases or multiple things, instead of adding details for each one, you can always upload a file and submit that information that way. Provide some type of explanation that will help us to make a determination. Once you've entered your information, you can always select Save. The summary screen for 300.204D will reappear, and it summarizes the data or information that you entered under the details screen. In this scenario, it provides an example for the purchase of the wheelchairs in previous year and the cost savings that were realized of about $16,000. If you notice, you've now entered data for each of the allowable exceptions that were available to you. You no longer have a shortfall. It's now 0. That's demonstrated in the application. And once you're ready, you select Next. Once you've entered all of your data, you no longer have to consider allowable exceptions. You've determined your expenditure amounts for state and local expenses. This is the summary screen that will appear once you've entered all the information. If you're one of the school divisions that didn't have to enter any information, you've met all your MOE requirements. Initially based on the 4 tests, you will not have information below the blue or the second highlighted blue area where it demonstrates the reduction summary. The reduction summary will show a summary of each of the allowable exceptions and the dollar amounts that you have entered. If you notice, there's a pending totals section. If you didn't meet any of the 4 tests, this particular screen may say you did not meet your MOE requirement because it's still pending approval and review by the DOE. Please don't panic. You can submit. There is a review process, and we do go through each of these individually, and we talk to most of the school divisions and send you emails and communications as we try to make sense and try to understand what it is you're trying to communicate and what you're trying to capture in the application. So no need to get concerned just yet. So if you didn't meet your initial MOE requirement, there are options that are available to you, and hopefully you can enter data for each of those options. Once you've gone through your particular scenario and you've entered information for each of the allowable exceptions, and you get to this section of the application, you can submit your data to DOE and feel confident that we will be in contact with you. So no need to panic, no need to get concerned that you didn't meet just yet, because there are still lots of information and lots of conversations to have around your MOE requirement. We do realize it will cost your school division if you have to repay money if you don't meet your MOE requirement. There may be conversations you have to have with your school board and with your superintendent concerning MOE. So we understand the sensitivity around maintenance of effort for special ed students. We have lots of conversations with finance officers about maintenance of effort and what it means and what it doesn't mean. When you are in economic downturns and you have situations where you're cutting budgets across the state or across your jurisdiction because you don't have the additional revenue, and someone comes to you and say, you can't cut special ed, I realize that's a difficult conversation to have because you're making cuts all over the place. However, there are some allowable exceptions that you can take advantage of if you know that you've had some retirements and you want to capture the information in the MOE application. So feel comfortable that you've done the best you can, you've entered the information that you have available, and we will go through each of those scenarios. We're now at the point where you can submit your information. It summarizes your information. There's pending until we review and approve. This is available for you. You can read it at your leisure, but in whatever the case, you can submit your data. We will review it, or you can save it for later submission if you want to, do some more thinking or have some discussions and come back to it at a later date. But once you've submitted your data, the collection window will close, and you can't make any further changes unless the collection window is reopened. We typically do not reopen the window just for resubmissions after the collection window has closed, meaning your date for submission is no longer available. Your MOE data is due February 28th, and you can submit that information and ask for the collection window to be reopened during that time period. If you submit after that date, we are still in the review process. So we will contact you if there are any changes that we need for you to make after the collection window closes. Let's say you've submitted your data to DOE. You've confirmed the accuracy of it. You have supporting documentation. You feel pretty comfortable. You've chosen submit to DOE. Once you select submit to DOE, this is your do-over. You can hit cancel to not submit, or if you're ready, hit OK. If you select OK, the collection window again will close. You will no longer be able to make revisions. This screen demonstrates that the collection window has closed for the 15-16 school year. You are no longer able to make changes to your data. We're now in the review process of your data. You've submitted your data to DOE. You will receive an email if and when you can submit your verification report. We do receive lots of phone calls each year from school divisions that says, I've submitted my data. I can't run my verification report. That's normally my indication that you didn't read or you missed that section of the guidance document. Your verification will not be available until the submission is approved and reviewed by the DOE. So, if you attempt to submit your verification in advance of receiving that email, it will not appear. So, no need to try to submit it. No need to call and say you can't, because we designed it that way. We want to make sure we are in communication with you. We've had some type of review and verification process. So as a result, once we've gone through the verification process and reviewed and approved, the submitter will receive an email that tells you you can now print out your verification report and fax it to DOE. You can either fax it or you can email. We don't need the original mailed. You can retain the original in your files or at the school division. We do retain a copy of the fax or the scanned copy from your superintendent in our records, but again, you're not required to pay the cost of mailing in an original signature to DOE. Again, the verification will not be available to you to run until after your submission has been reviewed and approved. After your submission, again, you'll be notified via email, or the submitter will. Once the submission has been approved, we ask that you log in, go to the report section of the application, and generate your 1516 verification report. If you do not submit your certified copy of your verification report on time, it will render your submission as incomplete and may affect your division's local determination metrics. Timely submission of data is critical to all of us. So be sure to be mindful of when the application window will close, and be mindful that once you receive that email, please move forward with submitting or printing your verification report for approval by your superintendent so that we can close this particular collection year for you. This slide demonstrates what you will see when you select the reports over on the right-hand side of the menu. You've already submitted your data. Your information has been reviewed. We've approved it. You've received your email. You've logged back in. You're going to run your verification report, print it out, and submit it. You're selecting verification report on this screen. What will appear next is for you to submit or select your 15-16 school year. Again, you can always go back and select previous years for comparison purposes. But for this submission, you're going to select 15-16, choose View Report. Once you view report, you can either open or save. In this scenario, we're opening the application in PDF format. The verification report will indicate whether you've met or have not met your MOE requirement. Hopefully, you would have met your MOE requirement, no longer needing to have any further discussions. Again, your verification report cannot be submitted until a notice approval of email has been received by the submitter. I'm saying that multiple times because I received this call multiple times. This particular screen is your example of a verification report. In this scenario, this particular LEA has met its MOE requirement after providing information for the various allowable exceptions. And based on those allowable exceptions, they have been gone through the review process and have been approved. And it demonstrates what your next level of effort will be in the coming school year. This is an example of the Maintain Exceptions report. Again, this provides a historical or a synopsis of previous year submissions along with your current year submission for historical purposes. Again, there are times when there are changes in personnel or changes in staffing or responsibilities, and it's always helpful to be able to go back and see what previous submissions are. Let's say you've gone through all of your scenarios, you submitted information for all the allowable exceptions, and the LEA still has not met its MOE requirement. Now what? If the final status after going through all the gyrations and all the data submissions, you have not met your MOE requirement, the LEA will be required basically to repay the amount of the shortfall. What will happen is the Department of Education will pay the amount of the division's shortfall or the amount of the division's Part B subgrant, whichever is lower. And this is covered under Section 300.203D of the Code of Federal Regulations for IDEA. And DOE will in turn pay the U.S. Department of Education for the amount of the shortfall. As a result of DOE making that payment, the VDOE will then establish a payment plan for the division to reimburse the Department of Education for the amount of those funds. And federal funds cannot be used to make this payment. The payment will need to come out of some other funding source, but it cannot be federal funds. This is a great reminder. The IDEA MOE 1516 submission was communicated, or the requirement was communicated under Superintendent's Memo 304-16. It was issued on December 16, 2016. The collection window opened December 19th and will close on February 28th. Please ensure to see your SSWS administrator within your locality in order to gain access to SSWS and to also gain access to the IDEA MOE application. The application can be used as a calculator when you prepare your annual plan. Remember, there is a compliance component to MOE and there is an eligibility component to MOE. The MOE web application can be used as a calculator as you're working on your annual plan, and you can determine whether the budgets that you're presenting to your school board will allow you to meet your eligibility requirement in the coming year. If you need any additional information, please contact DOE and we will attempt to clarify. If also there's additional information on the website, you can always go to doe.virginia.gov and over on the left side select special education, and once you select special education, click over on the right side, you will see grants and funding. Once you select grants and funding, there's a tab that's identified as reporting. Once you select that tab, you can go to the MOE section and find different publications of information from USED, along with Dear Colleagues letters, along with guidance documents that we prepared to assist you in your submission. As always, we're available for help. You can contact one of us. The staff member that's available to you for MOE questions will include Emily Booth, who's the primary contact person as she deals with the day-to-day, or myself, Tracy Coleman. If you need to call me, please do. Typically, I'm not as accessible or easily to access as Emily is, but both of us or one of us will be sure to get back with you if you need some help as quickly as we can. Email typically is the easiest way to contact me, as I'm not always in my office, but I do check emails periodically throughout the day, even when I'm away from the office. This concludes the presentation of the IDEA MOE data submission for 15-16. I'm pretty sure you're overwhelmed with the amount of information that has been covered. As always, contact us if you have any questions as it relates to this subject area or any other subject area. We're here to help. Thank you.